Hello all, Personnel Psych, here we go. This is our last lecture for the first module, so that this is 1.4, and we're going to talk fairness and legality. I can't stress the importance of understanding what we can do and what we can't do within an employment context. So hopefully we build a significant case as we move through this. And see what you think. We also have an assignment embedded in this. Surprise, surprise, surprise. So let us get started. Okay. So the legal and ethical aspects of personnel selection process, and as we just discussed in Psych and Law in the last lecture, the one before that, that what's legal and what's moral are often two different things. There's not a perfect overlap there. And in our context, what's ethical, what we believe to be ethical, and what we believe to be legal can be quite different. So I've chunked this in an effort to make it more manageable. It is a big module. I warn you about that. There's going to be a lot of detail in here that I'm not going to specifically go over. Remember that the lecture notes are serving as your textbook, so I have to include material in here so you have access to it, but it doesn't necessarily need to be discussed explicitly. Let's put a major caveat on this lecture. One thing to consider is that the law is a complex mechanism. Right, and to think that we might come out of, let's say we go to Fisher's Masters of Human Resources and become experts in employment law, I think that's probably not the case. So if you're working for a big firm, right, there's going to be lawyers that can answer questions for you. If you're talking about a smaller firm, then you probably want to have lawyers on retainer that can answer the most specific questions for you. So that is kind of the limitations there. Now, in Module 1.3, you know where I stand on the ethics and really trying to develop an employment process that is fair, that is inclusive, and that supports the needs of our community and our planet. So that's where I come from. Legality then seems to kind of present this minimum threshold on behavior, and I hope that we're able to exceed the requirements of the law on a regular basis, right? Take that as a relatively low bar. Now, ethics, on the other hand, take us a good step further. So what are we going to do? We're going to explain why complying with staffing laws can be strategic, one of our learning outcomes, right? We're going to discuss different types of employment relationships. We're going to discuss different kind of staffing related lawsuits. We're going to understand the role of validation, and this is a big word for us, super important word. Validation is the first line of defense to lawsuits, and this is something that's well within our expertise as we approach our exit with our degree in psychology or our degree in business, what have you. Discuss the role of affirmative action, equal employment opportunity, play in a firm staffing process. We're going to use adverse impacts statistics to understand how our process is operating, and we're going to describe finally various barriers to legally defensible staffing. So the contents, I hope that we successfully cover the why, the types of employment, the law and the guidelines. Law and guidelines is a big word for us. Disparate treatment and adverse impact, what are they, how do we calculate them, and how do we maintain good records to demonstrate that we're complying with the legal requirements. The process of validation, hopefully the avoidance of litigation, and the barriers. So let's begin with the why. All right. So why should legal compliance be something that we concern ourselves with? Well, right off the bat is avoid the expensive lawsuits. Lawsuits are expensive, right? And especially, even if we don't lose a lawsuit, right, it's expensive just to pay the attorneys for representing us. Another thing we might want to do then is avoid the negative public relations that come with litigation. We don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper looking bad in front of our potential customers, our potential suppliers, people that might not want to do business with us anymore because of the way we've behaved, right? It allows companies to capitalize on the strengths of diversity and perform better, right? Because they focus more on performance and merit and perhaps a tad less on diversity. And that's really kind of a tricky relationship. Be better able to hire quality people from all segments of the labor force, which is what we're about, is to hire people who fit the specifications for the job, right? So why do employment laws exist? Well, because the employer typically has a disproportionate level of power in that employer-employee relationship. And this grows really out of the Industrial Revolution, when we see that large companies begin to act with impunity. And as people migrated to the cities to work in these industrial settings, the factories, etc., it's not uncommon to see a line going out the door of people who want to work. And a lot of it was hired as day labor and paid as day labor. And if you complain, right, they're just like, hey, get the hell out of here. We got 50 people outside the door who are willing to take your place. So it's that kind of power that employers hold over us that needed to, at least some people believe, we needed to compensate, we needed to kind of level the playing field through a system of laws and guidelines. Right? So this helps for fairness and consistent treatment among different employees by prohibiting unfair discrimination in employment and providing equal employment opportunity, equal access for everyone. So, complying with employment laws, what are the benefits? Well, it enhances hiring quality, and I hope to make a case for that throughout the course, right? It enhances the firm's reputation and image as an employer, as someone who is in legal compliance. It promotes fairness perception among job candidates, and this is a huge thing. Remember, we talked, we don't want to create spillover effects where people talk ill of the company and our process, and we lose business, or we lose access to potentially excellent applicants, right? So these spillover effects are people talk. And there's an old saying in business that if you piss a customer off, they're going to tell a minimum of 10 people. All right? And who can afford that kind of ill will? So we treat our applicants like we would ourselves like to be treated. We treat our applicants like they would like to be treated. The employment practice models an ethical culture. Think about it. Probably your first interaction with a company that you're going to work for is the employment process. If you witness a high standard conformance to ethics, right? What is right, what is legal, what is ethical, in your first introduction to the company, then it sets up an expectation for that kind of behavior throughout one's employment, right? So model that ethical culture. Enhance organizational performance by ensuring that people are hired or not hired on the basis of their qualifications and not biases, right? And let's look, I mean, I hate to pick on the current administration, but how is that COVID vaccine rollout going? Let's face it, what we saw was a botched testing process, right? With not enough tests, not properly employed, and then I just read yesterday that the stockpiles of the COVID vaccine are already exhausted, right? And there's literally millions, hundreds of millions of doses the administration didn't purchase when it had the opportunity to, and other countries in the world have purchased those. So why does this happen? Well, who was put in charge of this? Well, there were people put in charge, selected to be in charge of the COVID response, who had no qualifications to do so. I'm sorry, Jared Kushner has no qualifications to lead a pandemic response. Where in his work history has he learned anything about that? Right? So the result of that absolutely imbecilic hiring process can mean the difference between life and death. We can see it in the COVID response, but we can see other occupations where if we engage in a mishire, that it can have, severe consequences. So we really owe it to ourselves as a people to develop the skill to be excellent hiring professionals. And we know how that leads on down the line to positive outcomes. So we can promote diversity, which can enhance an organization's appeal to a broader customer base. And certainly that's good for business every which way. So the types, well, let's talk about the types of employment relationships. And notice that these are not, there's somewhat fuzzy boundaries between these. And if it ever becomes a question, lawyers might argue the nuances to be specific about what this specific instance represents as far as an employment type. Some definitions, right? Well, an employee is someone hired by another person or business for a wage or fixed payment, right, in exchange for personal services, and who do not provide the services as part of an independent business. So an independent contractor performs services wherein the employer controls or directs the result of the work, but not necessarily how the work is done or who does the work. So when we hire an independent contractor, we're ceding some of our control to that independent contractor and how they will perform the work and who will specifically do that work. Now, contingent workers, any job in which an individual doesn't have a contract for long-term employment. So one of the terms that people at Ohio State have kind of banished, and they hate it when I continue to use it, and when I'm feeling salty, I do use this term. I describe myself as contingent faculty. And what does that mean? I'm faculty that the university has no responsibility to. They don't have to hire me next year if they don't want to, right? So I'm on an annual contract right now this year. I got a 3-year contract. It ran out, and with COVID, the university says, you guys are going to have to work a whole lot harder. We're not going to pay you anymore. And, oh, by that way, you're a senior lecturer, and we promise you that 3-year contract. Well, we're not doing that anymore. You're on an annual contract. So what I'm contingent. My employment is contingent upon the whims of the people who might hire me. Contingent faculty. It's not a popular term around Ohio State, right? So who are these temporary workers, leased workers, part-time seasonal workers, right? And I did a lot of work for Disneyland. When I was a teenager, my dad worked at Disneyland in the Disneyland band, and I did holiday and summer work, right? So that's seasonal employment. Unionized workers, hiring electricians for a project from a union hall, and that is kind of an old way of doing business, becoming less and less. And then outsourced work falls under this definition as well, and we know that a great deal of work is being outsourced to different areas. How you doing today, Penelope? You checking out the scene maybe before you take a nap? Annika was going all berserk. I thought she'd be up here, but I guess she's found something else to do. Now, employment at will. And what does it mean? Some states are, and note that employment law is often state-specific as well as has federal guidelines. So again, the need for lawyers to help us out and to understand this and negotiate this very complex web of laws. Employment at will is the definition. Either party can terminate the employment relationship at any time for just cause, no cause, any cause that isn't illegal, right? And there are some prohibitions with no liability as long as there's no contract or definite term of employment. So we can argue that many of us contingent faculty then, or lecturers, instructors, essentially fall under this area of employment at will. And you can see why tenure becomes such a holy grail for people in academia, because tenure then specifies that many of these things won't apply, at least until you get to the most extreme violation of circumstances. Following formal discipline termination procedures whenever possible is still avoided, still best advised to avoid discrimination and wrongful termination clause. And one thing that I'm going to suggest throughout this course is, man, you got to do excellent record keeping, right? And you have to have processes in place. And termination is going to be one of our final projects. We're going to look at how can we describe a termination procedure, and how can we do termination on an extremely fair and detailed basis, right? We just don't terminate people because we feel like it's a good thing to do at the time. What actual observable, measurable outcomes either occur or are not obtained, that can work either way, that then trigger a termination process, and what does that termination process look like? Right? So this is best used as a legal defense to keep the organization from being forced to follow its own policies inflexibly, that we do have some leeway. Signing an employment application, acknowledge receipt of an employment handbook, produces a written record that the policy has been read and understood, and this is something that we should, make sure that we do, is that we have people see the documentation, have a transparent hiring process, they have time to review the documentation, they sign that they understood it, and this is a good way to protect ourselves if necessary in the future. Now, What are some exceptions to employment at will? Retaliatory discharge, right? You can't retaliate. If someone brings a suit against your company, or if someone goes to the EEOC and says, look, my employer, I think, is breaking the regulations, you can't be fired, right? So it's kind of that whistleblower kind of flavor that you can't terminate people because they've complained. If you file a sexual harassment or you complain about sexual harassment, you should not be fired for having done so. Right? Now, the employed employment contract, the implied employment contract when employers' personnel policies, handbooks, right, indicate that an employee will not be fired except for good cause, right, or specifically a procedural process for hiring. So we really need to have that in place. I want to save that kind of for the end of the course. Implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, right? The example there would be firing an employee to prevent their vesting in the pension plan next month. And think about that someone has worked for the company for 24 years, their retirement accrues, they're vested in their retirement pension at 25, and here we are at 24 and 11 months, and boom, they kick them the hell out, right? And many companies do this, right? Ohio State has done this with some folks. Now, what I saw Ohio State do with 2 administrative level employees in the psychology department is just make their life so unbearable that they finally both quit. And interestingly, they were both like 64 years of age at the time. Yeah. So, federal state discrimination protection supersedes employment at will. So again, these protections that are out, especially in the guidelines. Let's talk for a moment about labor unions. I belong to several different unions. When I was in high school, I worked at a meat packing plant for a week. Oh my God, what a horrible job. Talk about freezing to death, right? What are you doing? Pushing carcasses around the place. Electron, stop that. Sorry about that, guys, but Electron is going to try and unplug the cord from the camera because he's fascinated with electricity because his name is Electron, right? So, and I worked at this meatpacking plant and shoving carcasses around in this freezer all day long. And I mean, you never get warm. It feels like you never get warm again because you go home, you could sit in a hot bath, maybe it warms you up. But I stayed there a week, but I had to join a union to be there. I've also belonged to the paper mill workers union, and that became the Teamsters union. And then at Columbus State, when I was there was a teachers union, a nice solid union, right? So what do they do for us? Well, they represent the workers. So they organize employees, they negotiate the terms of conditions of union members' employment. So for the actors union, what they do is they set a minimum, they call what scale. So if you show up to work on a movie, on a television show for a day, then the lowest amount you can pay was determined through negotiations between the studios and the production companies and the union. So it represents a minimum wage for that actual profession, right? In given context. At Columbus State, they would negotiate our salaries, right? And they would negotiate our pay raises, negotiate the hours we work, what we could be asked of, what we could do. So, the conditions of employment are contained in a contract called a collective bargaining agreement or a collective employment agreement, if you will. At Ohio State, since I've been at Ohio State and I started as a graduate student right in '99, there's been continual pushes to try and develop a union for graduate student workers, right? And also there's always rumblings, probably a lot less likely to happen, for instructors, lecturers, etc., to form a union so that they can protect themselves to a certain degree. Okay? Now, for union models, closed shop exclusively employs people who are already union members. So there might be a compulsory hiring hall, and let's say you need a pipe fitter, you're a builder, you're a contractor, and you need pipe fitters. Then you go to the union hall and you promise to hire people just from the union to do this work, right? So the employer has to recruit directly from what the union makes available to them. Now, a union shop employs both union and non-union workers, but new employees must join the union within a specified time limit. And that was very similar to the paper mill. You're hired in, and as soon as your probation period runs through, then you will join the union, no ifs, ands, or buts, right? An agency shop requires non-union workers to pay a fee to the union for its services negotiating. And this was the model at Columbus State. So my dear friend, Dr. Gentry, who had the office across from me, she didn't like unions. She didn't believe in unions, right? So she was not part of the teachers union. She can teach at Columbus State, but what the union requires and what the college requires is that she paid $750. She pays the same amount, right? Because the union still negotiates her contract, you know, her employment contract, whether she likes it or not. And then an open shop does not discriminate based on union membership in employing or keeping workers. Some workers benefit from the union or collective bargaining process despite not contributing to the union. So, and often people like that are considered to be free riders. I leave that up to you. So, what do you think? It's about time to talk the laws. Let's talk the laws. Okay. So, litigation forces change. What do we know? Hiring criteria, decisions based on whims, stereotypes, prejudice, or just getting it done are rarely, if ever, legally defensible. We need a well-detailed application process, and we need detailed records of where we recruit, who we hire from, a lot of statistics to look at. We'll get to it a little later in this lecture and beyond in the course, right? But it's all about legal defensibility. Over the last 40 years, significant changes have been in the law have prompted the need for defensible hiring and promotion practices. And let's start moving through. So we have the Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Previous to the enactment of the act, right, the government confined itself with things such as weights, measures, food safety, drug regulations, right? The government, its emphasis was on things. But with the adoption of the act, there's a whole new regulatory body that was created at the federal level that was designed to, for the first time, regulate behavior, right? And in this case, Title VII of the Act was directed at employment practices, that how do hiring, promotion, how do those bodies within an organization function. So both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were instrumental in the creation of the Act. And note, Kennedy was pushing for this hard. Johnson was the vice president, and when Kennedy was horrifically assassinated, then Johnson stepped in. And Johnson continued on with many of the ideas and policies that Kennedy had been pushing forward. Johnson talked about the Great Society, and he was talking about a society that would encourage diversity, encourage equality, and that was the image. Johnson was a visionary, right? And he was saying that America has a responsibility to become the Great Society. And these laws, these regulations, were a way to change behavior to move towards that. So what are some of the provisions of Title VII? Hiring and firing decisions can't be made on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. And those are the protected classes at this point in time. So discrimination can, if it can be pointed out, then it's in violation of the Act. But that's for race, color, religion, gender, or national origin at that point in time. Nothing else, just those categories. Employers can't segregate or classify employees to deprive them, right, of employment opportunities on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. And employment agencies may not fail or refuse to refer candidates on the basis of the same qualities. So if someone at some point says, look, you know, we need some temporary secretaries and we want them to be the right color, wink, 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 implying white rather than anything else, no, we're going to be in violation there, right? So all provisions apply equally to employers, labor orgs, or joint labor management committees controlling training programs. And you think training programs? Well, a lot of unions operate training programs, and if they have preferential admission to training programs, that is, some people are more likely to be allowed into the training program, increase their skill set, and eventually make more money, right? Can't play that game. Advertising employment or training opportunities can't indicate preference for any kind of groups. And this is funny because if you look at ancient newspapers, back in the day, you look in the want ads and it would say something, it would say things like, want woman typist. Well, you can't say that. You want a typist. You want someone who types. It shouldn't necessarily matter whether it's a man, woman, black, white, Hispanic, Asian. These things should not matter, right? And should not be part of the advertisement. So that was eliminated. Retaliation against people who have opposed unlawful employment practices is not allowed. So you can't screw people over on the basis of them standing up for their rights as outlined in the Act. And further regulations. Now, exemptions to the Act. Well, it doesn't apply to employment of aliens outside any state, right? So, that's just not going to be applied there. Doesn't prevent religious organizations from hiring its own adherents. So that's an interesting exception, and it kind of makes sense. You can see where a religious body, a church, might want to hire people of its own congregation, or at least its own faith in their organization. And the separation of church and state, kind of factors into this as well, and I don't want to get into that. Some preferential hiring is endorsed, like Native Americans around reservations can be given favored applicant status, right? And seniority systems that exist were protected. Now, an exemption that's critical to us, and this is the core thing, this is what makes this course possible, so I can't stress the importance of what I'm going to say here, is you can't discriminate on the basis of the ability to do the job. Core foundation for the course. And it's the core foundation for our legal defense. Because if we do a good job analysis and say, hey, this is what the person does in this position. These are the requirements of this job. And that means that we have to have these person specifications that we have empirically demonstrated for successful and necessary performance of this job, right? So ultimately, if we run a fair, valid, reliable selection process, it's the ultimate defense in the people we've hired. And we're going to learn how to do that through this course. And this is the fascinating thing, is how do we apply science to the hiring practice? Okay, so that's where we're going. Now, in the next set of modules, we dedicate ourselves to qualifications, and we have been using the term fit, and we're going to talk qualifications. Note, too, the word discrimination above has a strong relation to the word selection. So to discriminate might be to not allow, but the selection process can be biased on these category memberships, and in fact it should not. Selection process should be tied explicitly to observable behaviors that we've validated as demonstrating superior performance, necessary performance in a given job. So the Act as we're describing it, also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. And it was empowered to investigate perceived violations against the Act and its components. It was charged with either bringing suit or dismissing unfounded charges. So it was initially envisioned, right? What we're talking about, it was initially envisioned as a persuasive body saying, come on guys, let's do it right, and here's the error of your ways, and let's correct these and be cool, right? But over time, it was demonstrated that in fact it needed more teeth, it needed the ability to enforce, and it became increasingly litigious because that is the way the enforcement takes place, is through lawsuits for unfair or discriminatory hiring practices. So, now, we've heard a lot about affirmative action, and affirmative action is trying to redress historic wrongs. That is, we're going to attempt to level the playing field that we've observed to harm people of color, gender in the past as far as hiring practices. Affirmative action policy creates adverse impact on another group, then charges of reverse discrimination may be leveled against the employer. So there's this fine balance between advantaging, let's say, people who've been disadvantaged in the past, but at the same time not disadvantaging people who have been advantaged in the past. I know that's a mouthful, but it's trying to find a balance point where and obviously, you know, some people feel threatened by new employment regulations because they believe that they're losing opportunity, right? So affirmative action suffers the fewest challenges when it's perceived as specifically redressing the adverse impact. But consider my ex-brother-in-law, was the brother of my second wife, so that's a billion years ago. And he got out of high school and he screwed around quite a bit, and eventually he decided to settle down, at least in part, and he wanted to work for the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles. Now, his father worked for the Department of Water and Power at that point for 20-some years, ever since he got out of the service in Korea, and worked for the Department of Water and Power for the electric aspect. So my brother-in-law, Mark, went and applied, and you have to take a test, and it's a bogus test. It's kind of like a civil service test, which should be thrown out, had no ability to predict job performance. But he takes the test, and then you get a score on the test, and I remember he came bitching to me because he said I did really well on the test, but he said African Americans get 10 points added to their score for being African Americans. And my brother-in-law was kind of racist to begin with, right? And this just made him livid. He says, we both take the same test and they get 10 points just because of their color. That's reverse discrimination. And I don't want to comment. I mean, I don't want to give any opinion here. You guys think about it as you will. But the deal is, historically, certain groups have been disadvantaged by other groups. And affirmative action is an attempt to redress that imbalance, what's been done to people in the past. Note, though, that many people have a strong distaste for it. So, and others say, hey, you know, it needs to be done, and it may piss some people off now, but, you know, let's move past that. So, what about the EEO, equal employment opportunity? What about affirmative action, and what about quotas? And quotas is often a misused and misunderstood term. So, equal employment opportunity, employment practices are designed and used in a facially neutral manner. And one of my pet peeves about diversity and diversity initiatives, and I'll just say it briefly, is that when we talk, you know, in the United States about diversity, we focus on the most obvious characteristics that are visibly available to us. Skin color, gender differences, typically the way where we focus. Note, there's literally tens of thousands of ways that we can differ. For example, intelligence. We have some people who have very high IQs, we have some people who have very low IQs, and we have some people, the mass of people, somewhere in the middle. Should it be possible to discriminate on the basis of intelligence, or lack thereof, right? But yes, and in fact, that is the case. But it's not we like the simple, visually recognizable types of diversity, right? What about extroverts versus introverts? What if we're saying, well, you know, for a sales job, I'm going to give someone a test on their level of extroversion or introversion, and I'm not interested in introverts. And that would be allowable. But notice that introversion, extroversion is another dimension of diversity, but not necessarily something that shows on our face. A lot of strange issues to consider as we move through the course. Now, affirmative action, it's the proactive effort to eliminate discrimination and its effects to ensure non-discriminatory results in employment practices in the future. Okay? An affirmative action plan describes in detail, and that's critical, right? The actions to be taken, procedures to be followed, standards to be adhered to. So if you want to, or you're participating with an affirmative action program, it better be well documented, right? Now, staffing quotas establish specific requirements, but certain percentages of disadvantaged groups be hired to equalize their proportional representation for underrepresented groups in the company's workforce with their proportions in the organization's relevant market. We're going to talk about statistics that are used to calculate this. Quotas are often not directed towards private businesses, but may in fact be in place for businesses that engage in federal contracts. So if you want to, and the paper mill would be an example of this, right? The paper mill often bids on federal contracts. That is, how much copy paper do you think the Pentagon uses? They use, literally tens of thousands of tons of copy paper, and you want to bid that contract to supply paper, well, then the federal government will be more strict about the makeup of your workforce, and they may then start talking in terms of hiring quotas or for your organization because you're supplying federal contracts. Now, if you're a private business and you don't care about engaging in federal or state level contracts, then quotas are not really applicable, and no one is going to enforce them on people. Now, affirmative action plans involving preferential treatment. What should be some of the components of this? Got to be remedial in nature. That is, we have to first and foremost say, this is the imbalance that we want to address, and our affirmative action employment is remedial. That is, it's designed specifically to address this imbalance. It can't exclude all minorities, so you can't say we're just not hiring any of these people, period. That's going to get people into trouble with reverse discrimination lawsuits. It should be temporary, and the time limits should be specified. Now, that's open to modification as we assess its effectiveness, but it should have that component, and it should be formalized. It should be in writing. It should be not just be something that we just do, right? So, the Equal Opportunity Commission then enhances the following, enforces the following federal statutes: the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967. And think about it. Here I am, Penelope, do not knock over that camera. She's looking for something bad to do. You can just see it in her. She's standing right next to the camera there, and she's going to do evil. Penelope, what are you doing? Come over here. Right now. Think about me. I'm 63 years old. If I leave this job, who the hell's going to hire me? And that becomes problematic, right? So, and I'm attractive to fire because maybe there's a bunch of young people that want to take my place, right? The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. And note that women were often non-preferred hires because they get pregnant, and then we got to replace them, or we have to, make accommodations for them. Others, just go ahead and read down this list. I don't want to read them all, but let's go down to this one point here. The EEOC, right, receives over 90,000 charges a year, so it's a busy organization to investigate and potentially litigate these cases. Right? Now, the EEOC ultimately should and does to a certain extent. Right there, you are. You're not going to tear shit up now? Okay, that's my good girl. All right. EEOC encourages, facilitates voluntary compliance through tailored programs to meet the needs of employers to educate them about EEOC laws. Right? So, key elements for successful that support successful EEO programs: study, know the laws, know the standards, plan, know the relevant workforce demographics, define the problem, propose solutions, develop strategies for achieving them. If that doesn't sound like the Holy Trinity, needs assessment, at least the first two parts: is there a need, and what is the program we're going to use to address that need? Notice the evaluation isn't necessarily built into that point. Lead, have all levels of management champion the cause, and if they don't, then maybe we got to think about replacing some of those folks. Encourage, link pay and performance on how employees interact, support, and respect each other. Not necessarily well done. Notice, monitor the impact. There's the evaluation component. Discuss, communicate, reinforce that diversity is a business asset, that diversity is good for business, and too many people don't understand, don't recognize, or want to resist that notion. And then dedicate, assign needed resources, right? To stay persistent, investment in EEO. And I want you to consider this idea. Let's suppose we're an employer and we hire, essentially from our own county or maybe a 4-county area. And we say, we would hire more people of color, but they come to us not being able to even do basic mathematics or use clear written grammar. And then you say, well, okay, but if I'm going to dedicate myself to the effort of leveling the playing field, and the schools are deficient, right, in graduating people who are not capable of performing these tasks that we need, then what can we do in the community? What can we do with the school to help level the playing field at the lower educational levels, so that the people of color can come to us with equal skills, equal ability to the counterpart, to the other racial group that we prefer to hire. So it's a bigger picture, it's a larger picture, and to what extent do employers feel some responsibility to their community? And we know that many employers just simply don't feel any responsibility to their local community, and they leave that up for grabs. But this becomes then a much larger kind of philosophical and political issue, and it's up to you to determine where you stand on it. Right? So, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance is part of the Department of Labor Standards Administration, responsible for administering and enforcing, right, 3 equal employment opportunity programs that apply to federal contractors and subcontractors. These are the people I described. And again, let me give you another example. When I worked for the construction firm, and when I first got to Salem, Oregon, I worked for a construction for a year, and some jobs were private jobs, but the owner of the company, right, more than anything, he liked to bid state level and federal jobs. And then because he's bidding these government contracts, they then specify to some extent what the workforce, what the work crews will look like. And this created preferential opportunities for some people. I remember one guy I worked with, what was it? Steve Orr. Great guy, young guy, and he was 50% Native American. And he was a super desirable hire, was put into the carpenters union, was going to be groomed to become a carpenter, etc., because he's a valuable asset when bidding contracts for state and federal jobs. So, did some interesting jobs. Built a way station on I-84. I remember I worked on that one. We built a school in Central Oregon. Also built the Mount St. Helens Visitor Center up there in Washington. So big-time contracts. Ensures that federal contractors with at least 50 employees who receive $50,000 or more in grants, goods, services take affirmative action to promote the equal opportunity and annually file appropriate affirmative action plans to make obvious what they're doing. So, the OFCCP's mission is to ensure non-discrimination, to expand opportunities. As I was describing for Steve, let's get him into the situation where he becomes a full-fledged carpenter, right? And to make sure that all employment decisions are inclusive and supportive of diversity. So, primary lies on compliance reviews and complaint investigations, right? And although the OFCCP does enforce affirmative action compliance, it focuses on greater extent on class action discrimination. That is large-scale discrimination. And it conducts systematic reviews of employees' employment practices to search out discrimination. So again, record keeping. And when you have great records that fully delineate how you're operating, it makes this go much smoother. When you start having shady records, it makes people, the investigators, suspicious, and they start to dig deeper. Right? So, now we have to answer the question, who's an applicant, because that has to be defined. If we're protecting applicants' rights, then we better be able to classify who, in fact, is an applicant. So the legal definition of applicant is particularly important, right? Only applicants can establish a prima facie case of unlawful discrimination. If you're not an applicant, then there's no standing to file this case. Employers must determine who qualifies as an applicant in order to identify the gender and race of all applicants. If you're going to keep statistics, that is, who did we test, who did we interview, and then who did we hire? Well, the first number that you have to be able to quantify is how many people applied, right? And understand the definition of applicant can help employers minimize the risk for themselves and the cost of expensive lawsuits. So it's critical, right, to establishing the proportion of the applicant pool that was actually hired, and slice and dice that by ethnicity and gender. So how's applicant defined? Well, the individual submits an expression of interest in employment through the internet or related search technologies. The contractor considers the individual for employment in a particular position. The individual's expression of interest indicates the individual possesses the basic qualifications for the position, right? And Ohio State has made it pretty clear that they're not going to hire anyone to be a lecturer and certainly faculty in the psychology department unless they have a PhD. So if someone comes in with a bachelor's degree and says, I would like to apply as an instructor, it's not going to fly because they don't meet the minimum qualifications in that. And employers are allowed to set those qualifications to a certain degree. At Columbus State, I sat on some of our hiring committees, and our minimum bar was a master's degree at Columbus State. So someone could come to us with a master's degree, and we just learned that through experience. Yeah, we said, well, we should only hire people with PhDs, but the thing is, when you start looking at candidates, we had candidates who put in superior performances in our employment evaluation process, right, our applicant process, that clearly did a better job having only a master's degree. I know that sounds kind of shitty, right? The individual at no point in the contractor selection process prior to receiving an offer removes himself, says, I'm no longer interested in the job, then they're no longer at that point an applicant, right? Now, we've got a bunch of tables here pointing out the different laws, and note how the table, I'm just going to go over kind of the generic form of the table. So we have the law or the executive order, and then who is covered. So to whom does it pertain? What does it do, right? And where can you find further information? So I'm kind of including this. For the most part, it's going to be useful for one of our assignments, but also kind of, you know, we were thinking about this kind of serves as your textbook. So here we go. All right. So, and you go on the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 78, American with Disabilities Act of 1990, and let's take this one for example. Who's covered? Private employers, right, with at least 15 employees, local, state, and federal governments, so they're required. Qualified individual with or perceived as having a disability to whom it applies, right? And then it levels the playing field for those people. So, others, the ADA amendment, right? And that instructs courts and employers to adopt a broad standard when determining whether it's an individual considered disabled. What exactly does it include? And so you go on down the list, right? And so on. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of these. That is up to you, right? And we'll see how we're going to use this in our assignment. And it goes on. Note that if you're going to become a human resources professional, it's not, you know, out of the realm of possibilities that you'll actually have a class in employment law. But again, I think with the complexity and the number of these laws, our expertise should be in doing job analysis and creating person specifications and selecting the tools to measure applicants' fit to those specifications. That should be the gist of what we do within the law, but understanding the law and its complexity is best left to people who went to law school, right? And so it goes. So let's jump to our homework assignment. And this is the part A is the laws and guidelines. So, listen up. what do I need? I need the team leader must email me at least 1 week before the assignment is due. I will reply with a statement from someone in a fictitious company. The statement could very well be in violation of the guideline. So, let me explain again. Team leader, whoever's the team leader, throughout the course, if you designate that, or who's the team leader on this assignment, I don't care how you want to do it, but they're going to email me and they're going to say, give me HW3 Part A. And I'm going to give you a brief little clip, a brief little scenario that says, hey, this is what's going on, right? It could be something as simple as like, you know, who are you going to hire? You know, this is the scenario that's unfolding, and we're talking about a bar. And they say, well, who are you going to hire? And said, you talked to 3 women today. You talked to 5 applicants today. Who are you going to hire? And I say, you know what? I think I'm going to hire the woman with the big boobs because customers, you know, that attracts more customers. Is that a legal hiring decision? Is that a legal hiring criteria? And that's something that I want you to go through the laws and kind of make that determination, right? So which law or guideline may be violated? And I'm not expecting you to be an expert. You could say, hey, I think that this one may be violated, right? And then explain why you believe that. And then finally, what could be done? And you will have a homework template, right? So you will use your template and you will just answer the questions within the template, and that's what you will turn in. And it's a multi-part assignment, so we will move through, right? This is, you can see, homework 3, part A. And part of the deal for you guys is to negotiate who's going to do what, right? And who's going to do the ultimate edit of the assignment, who's responsible for turning it in. Now, let's talk about the Uniform Guidelines and Employment Selection Procedures. Right, this is known as the guidelines. So at the beginning of the lecture, I talked about laws and guidelines. Right, and they, along with influential court cases, attempt to define the legal context of personnel decisions. 2 critical concepts emerge from the guidelines: adverse impact and disparate treatment. What are they? Well, they sound fancy. Let's talk about them. So disparate treatment, defined as evidence that a candidate from a protected group, right, and that's protected according to the law, that would be ethnicity, that would be gender, right? It's not going to be necessarily intelligence. It's not going to be on the spectrum of introversion to extroversion, for example, the previous example I used, right? The intentional discrimination based on a person's protected characteristics is going to then demonstrate disparate treatment. We are treating people disparately differently, right? Can be direct. Example resulting from a company's policy not to hire older workers. And if age is a protected category, which it is, and we say, oh, we're not going to hire those people because they're too old, and old people are slow, or whatever our rationale is, right? If someone explicitly states we're not going to do that, then it would be indirect. But it can also be indirect. It can be inferred from situational factors or result from a combination of permissible and prohibited factors. So how do we figure this out? Well, to establish, right, this type of case of discrimination under the theory of disparate treatment, the plaintiff, that is the person bringing the suit, must show that they belong to the group. If they don't belong to the group, then they don't have standing, and the complaint is dismissed at that point, right? That he or she applied for the job, was qualified for the job for which the employer is seeking. Now, notice, if someone is not qualified, and the big question is, well, how do we know they're qualified or not? And we get to that later in the course, right? Then they are capable, right? That despite being qualified, they were rejected, so there has to be a rejection to trigger this process. The plaintiff doesn't need to prove that he or she was rejected because of his projected status, only that despite his or her qualifications, they were rejected. So I'm qualified and I belong to this group, right? That after being rejected, the position remained open and the employer continued to see applicants whose qualifications were similar. So if an employer doesn't hire this person, they say, well, they're treating me unfairly because they didn't, but the employer says, look, we decided we didn't need someone, or we decided we didn't like any of the applicants, so we just closed the position. Now, how long does the position have to remain closed? Well, that's kind of, up for grabs. Inferring disparate treatment, if we reach this bar, if these are then achieved, now notice what happens. The plaintiff had to demonstrate these. Now, the defendant, the burden shifts to the dependent. The burden then shifts to the employer to show that the discrimination is the result of bona fide occupational qualification. Take that word to heart. And that word is like one of the core concepts in our course. What we're going to do is say, look, we brought in the applicants, we tested them on the basis of bona fide occupational qualifications, and based on those tests, we rank ordered our applicants and we hired at the top levels, right? So if you do a thorough job analysis, create person specifications, these become your bona fide occupational qualifications. If someone doesn't meet them, you can demonstrate that then they have no legal leg to stand on at that point. If the employer shows that discrimination is based on a business necessity, so these bona fide occupational qualifications do have to be tied to a business necessity, right? That I can't do my business successfully without having these qualifications in place, and I can demonstrate this through legitimate, valid evidence, right? Showing the employer's stated reason for the rejection was false and merely a pretext. So sometimes we say, well, and think about firefighting. How did women break in to the occupation of firefighting? One of the initial tests for firefighters was they had this 150-pound dummy, and you would have to do the fireman's carry of this 150-pound dummy. And we can't hire women because we can't find any women, or hardly any women, who can carry this 150-pound dummy. But then we stand back and we say, well, but is that really a bona fide occupational qualification? Is that a business necessity? Can you not do your job as a firefighter if you are unable to carry this 150-pound dummy? And then we kind of, that sets off a whole chain of trying to determine what firefighters do, what they don't do, and what, is a necessary ability in a firefighter. So, to establish a case allowed to go to court, the plaintiff need not prove that discrimination was a motivating factor in the hiring or promotion decision, only raise an inference that the misconduct occurred, right? So that's all that's necessary there. Let's try homework 3, part B. In your example, and this is attached into addendum 1, right? Is there evidence of disparate treatment? Answer all the questions below for each one of the 3 examples. And then explain why you think so, who's affected, if it's believed that there was disparate treatment, on whom does the burden fall to demonstrate the disparate treatment. Note, the slides leading up to this, the 3 or 4 slides, what I'm going to do now is provide you with an example, and then you do the thinking, you do the hard work, and figure out how to answer these questions. What is the potential, let's go to the next, because it's not done yet. What is the potential reason for the observed disparate treatment? Upon the demonstration of disparate treatment, how does the burden of proof shift, and to who, which is something we just discussed. And you're going to have to, don't expect to just look at this homework assignment and say, oh, got it. No, you're going to have to think through this stuff. I'm intentionally making it challenging. I'm intentionally making it difficult because you guys are up to the task. And when you finish the assignment, I want you to feel that you've actually thought through, learned something, and did some hard work to craft your answers to the assignment, right? Better psychologically. And what can be done to potentially decrease the disparate treatment? And this is kind of forward looking. So it's good to know how to calculate it, but what can we do to avoid it in the future? And I'm viewing you guys as future hiring professionals. So I want you to be able to be proactive. Look at a system that you say, man, I'm thinking that's probably going to create disparate treatment. How can we change it so that we avoid disparate treatment? Now, adverse impact. Let's talk about this one. Adverse impact is when the action is demonstrated to affect different groups differentially. While disparate treatment is designed to protect individuals, right, adverse impact refers to groups. So disparate treatment is hey, this screwed me over, this process, right? But what we're looking at then is a different statistic, a global statistic, if you will, when we're talking adverse impact. And adverse impact requires a defense of business necessity. So, and I've got some examples coming up here. Not the perceived survival of a business. That is, my business will die if I follow this policy. No. That's not. It's demonstrate a legitimate, honest God, right now business necessity. The selection procedure must be related to job behavior. And this is the validation process. So we'll look at some examples. Now, the first three types of statistics, right? The first two are advisory. So there's three calculations that fall under the umbrella, the heading of adverse impact. The first two are advisory. The third is more process oriented. So let's take a look at each, and you're going to be doing these, right, as part of your homework. You'll be actually calculating these. So stock relationship is the relationship of minorities in a job category compared to qualified people in a population. So what we do is we do the demographic. We look at the demographic reports, right, that include qualifications, perceived qualifications, and ethnicity or gender, whatever it is, if you will, and this is what exists in the community. And then what we can look at is this is what's hired. Is what's hired reflective of what exists in the community? Or is there some statistically demonstrable difference between that, right? If you have a community that's 50% Hispanic, but we only see maybe 3% Hispanic in the workforce, then we start wondering, well, you're drawing your people from the community, but how come it doesn't match up, right? More on this. Concentration, internal assessment of job class relation to members in those classes. Again, I will provide examples for each of these. And then flow statistics. This is when this is the process of hiring. We look at the applicants, right? And we look at the hiring ratios for different positions. So it's much more explicit and timely about the hiring process. The others are, the first two are about larger issues. So let's take them as examples. And you will have to generate the tables, right? Because what we're in part about in this class is record keeping. And so you have to be able to communicate your data effectively, and that's a component of this course. Adverse impact. Let's look at the first one, stock statistics, right? Compare the percentage of men, women, or minorities employed in a job category with their availability in the relative population of qualified people interested in the position. Notice that might be a little hard to get at, but so stock statistic. Females in the availability in the population within our community, it's about 60% female, it's about 40% male. And then we look at the position of clerical workers within the organization, and what do we see? We see that about 80% of clerical workers are female and 20% of clerical workers are male. Well, this looks like females are advantaged to work in clerical positions. So I can point this out that if I'm a man and I want this clerical position, I might then, on the basis of this idea, bring a disparate treatment suit. Now, let's look at the concentration statistics. All right. Compare percentage of men, women, minorities in various job categories to see if men, women, or minorities are concentrated in certain workforce categories. If half of an organization's employees are female, right, but women tend to comprise 90% of the clerical workforce, and men comprise 90% of the managerial workforce, women may be underutilized in managerial positions, and men underutilized, strangely enough, right, in clerical positions. Now, we can do this for gender, we can do this for ethnicity, we can do this basically for any protected class. So the example here is the concentration. Well, what do we see in our organization? We see whites, 30% in sales positions, 15% of clerical positions are held by whites, and 80% of management positions are held by whites. We see blacks, 50% of our sales force is African American, 20% clerical, and then but we see then a different shift, and these numbers are looking very suspicious. And we say, why are certain positions favoring certain ethnicities, right? And that is the concentration of employees of color and or gender in these areas of our organization. So, both the AI stock and concentration statistics both provide baseline measuring for assessing future diversity initiatives. So we look at these and we say, is that what we want our organization to look like? Are we happy with that? What can we do to redress this? What diversity initiatives do we need to institute to kind of level or even this out, right? So stock statistics facilitate understanding of business context and community, and concentration statistics facilitate understanding of organization staffing efforts at the category level. So that's two tools, right? Now, let us talk about adverse impact then. Adverse impact is if the selection ratio of one group is less than 80% of the selection ratio of another group. Now, for example, let's suppose a company has 80 white applicants and 20 black applicants for the job. So we post a job, and here comes, right, our applicants, 100 in total, right? What we're going to do is we have to track the ethnicity and the gender of our applicants. This is part of, facilitates our statistical analysis, right? And this is just good record keeping. So if the company hires 25% of the whites, then it's reasonable to expect that the company would hire at least 20% to 30% of the African Americans. And how do we do this? We do the math, and I'll show you more in a more detailed math. So the 80% rule is simply an enforcement trigger. If we see that there's less than 80, if we have this number of whites hired and then the number of African Americans falls below 80% of the white hired number, then that's a trigger for potential enforcement, right? The 80% rule is subject to interpretation within the organization's context, but it's important for us to understand. So these flow statistics then are really compare the percentage of applicants hired from subgroups to determine if they're significantly different from each other. So this is something you definitely will want to do is, man, we had 200 applicants, here's the ethnic breakdown, or here's the gender breakdown. What was the actual hiring? And what proportion then of each applicant group was hired? How do those proportions compare? So, and you'll be doing these tables not in short order. So flow statistics for sales positions, we had 200 applicants, male applicants, we had 100 female applicants. So these are the honest gut people who applied for the job. Now let's look at our hiring records. Well, we hired 100 of the men. We hired 25 of the women. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, our selection rate then for the men was we hired 1 out of every 2. That is 50%. But for women, we only hired 1 out of 4, 25%. So we do the math, is 25% 80% of 50? Is 25 80% of 50? No, it's 50%. It's half, right? So now we have an issue. That is, we didn't meet that minimum bar of 80%. So the Uniform Guidelines and Employee Selection Procedures state organization must keep records of these applicant flow statistics, and applicant selection rates must be calculated. And this is for each job category. This is both for external hires, that is hiring external people to new positions, but also for internal hires looking at new people within the organization. And it's got to be done by applicant race and sex. So this is where good record keeping comes in. And you know, you might say, well, you know, if we truly want to be egalitarian, why are we even looking at, you know, or including information about applicant gender or race? And it's like, come on. We're going to have to do that because we have to be able to demonstrate that we're conforming. So homework 3, part C. In your 3 examples attached to addendum 2, is there evidence of adverse impact? See the addendum for additional assignment requirements, the tables to be produced, and I'll have sample tables for you. Right? If so, who is impacted in all cases where adverse impact? So you look at the situation, you look at the numbers I've given you, and then you determine, is there evidence of adverse impact? And if there was evidence of adverse impact, which group did it affect? Right? What is a potential con to the proposed remedy, and what is one potential remedy? So I'm always going to hit you with the pros and cons. Now, homework 3 continued for concerns about adverse impact, the concentration statistic, what's a potential remedy, and there you go. Right? So move through those. Okay. And you can see what my expectation is for you moving through these. You're going to have to discuss this with each other. You're going to have to help each other. You're going to have to move through this. This is teamwork at its finest. You're going to need a shared workspace. You're going to need ways to communicate with each other. So you're going to have to figure out ways to facilitate that to happen. So establishing an adverse impact case, then the plaintiff must prove, generally through statistical comparisons, that the challenge practice or selection device has a substantial adverse impact on the protected group. The defendant can then criticize the statistical analysis or offer different statistics. Again, good record keeping. The plaintiff comes and says, hey, this is what we observed. The defendant says, actually, I don't like those numbers. Here's my numbers, and this is why it is not as the plaintiff states. Right? If the plaintiff establishes disparate impact, the employer must prove that the challenge practice is job-related and, again, business necessity based on bona fide occupational qualifications. Even if the employer proves business necessity, the plaintiff may still prevail by showing that the employers refused to adopt alternative employment practice, right, that would satisfy the employer's legitimate interest without having disparate impact. So just defenses, we've always used this hiring process, and this is the results it yields. Within the course of the litigation, people can come back and say, well, could you adopt a different process? And if it's shown that a different process could be adopted, then in fact that may be that the employer is then urged to do so. Now, not options for adverse impact. Assessment scores can't be altered or changed to reduce the adverse impact on protected groups. So we can't go in and start changing scoring on our measurement devices. Right? Assessment test results cannot be ignored simply because they have an inverse. So we test a whole bunch of people and we find out that our test created adverse impact, so we just throw out that. No. So what are the options under adverse impact? We can do the modification. The selection procedure is modified to no longer adversely impact the group. And this is one reason why we track this, is we say, we have a new applicant process and we're going to test our applicants in a new way. Do our new tests create adverse impact? And this is why we track the statistics. Because if they do, then we need to alter our selection process, right? And this requires a carefully designed research returning back to the job analysis and person specifications that yielded the tests we're using for our applicants. Now, elimination is another option. That is simply eliminate the current adverse impact process, right? But if it's a valid selection process, that would represent a return to a less effective process and is not really desirable. Other options, validation. And this is something we're going to learn to do. Great concept. Demonstrate the selection process serves an important necessary purpose. Demonstrate, validate that our selection process taps into bona fide occupational qualifications and reliably rank orders candidates on the basis of those qualifications. Right? So validation is accomplished via statistical methods or case law, more common sense based. But really it's the statistical techniques, and since those of us who are here at Ohio State generally have a pretty significant course load involving research methods and statistical analysis, at least the basics, we're almost already prepared to be able to do this. So what are the types of validation? Well, 3 types of validation. Criterion validation. A criterion must represent critical or important job duties, work behaviors, or work outcomes. Right? That is, if I come in and say, hey, what is your astrological sign? And then I rank order people according to the very basic fire, air, earth, or water signs. And I say, I want fire signs and air signs, but I don't want any earth or water signs. And you say, what is the position we're describing here? And we're talking sales representatives. And I say, well, how does one's 4 positions in the zodiac determine, and it ain't there, right? We're not going to get there. So criterion validation, samples used relevant to labor market for the job in question. One criterion that we used at Columbus State when we would hire instructors, one of the things that people had to do was deliver a 10-minute mini lecturette on the functions of a neuron. That is, if we hire you at the psychology department in Columbus State, you're going to be teaching Psych 1100. We know that. Everyone teaches Psych 1100 at Columbus State. We offer like 70 sections a semester of Psych 1100. And Chapter 2, well, it may not be Chapter 2, but it's going to be a chapter in Psych 1100 is the brain science, right? And we're going to talk about neurons. So we would observe an applicant deliver a 10-minute lecturette on the functions of a neuron. This is relevant to the labor market and the job in question. It's a slam dunk. Now, the observed relationship between predictor and criteria should be statistically tested p less than 0.05. So we want to be able to statistically demonstrate that the ability to do the job is linked to this applicant's test that they're taking, right? And we want to be able to do the statistical analysis on that, correlational analysis. That is, and we can look at success. Let's say this is a tough one, but if we look at teaching success, right, and then we look at the ability to explain the functions of a neuron, what is the correlation between those? So if you get a score, hey, what we see is that people score above on a scale of 1 to 10, their explanation of a neuron, people who are 7, 8, 9, 10 in quality of their explanation, and then we tie that to some performance measure, right? We can do this statistical analysis, the correlational analysis. 3 types of validation, what are they? Content validation, uses job analysis to identify work behaviors clearly linked to effective performance, right? Relative importance and production of expected products. Construct validation, determine the constructs that underlie effective behavior, and empirical support is very useful here. So let's look at some actual cases as examples, and I know what we've done so far is probably relatively confusing. We don't have the benefit of being able to stop the lecture and ask live questions, but hopefully these examples should help you through. And also, I think homework 3, as you take it step by step, if you say at the beginning of homework 3, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, I got no clue, but if you spend a little time with it, what you'll see is you'll get it, right? But you're going to have to spend some time, and this is the weird thing about the online environment. One thing I really miss doing is because ultimately, at some point during this lecture, we would stop in class and I would say, okay, break into teams and let's do it. And then you guys would be in teams, and I get to travel around the room and see how all of you are doing. Maybe by fall we'll get to do that. Who knows? Hopefully the next attempt at our vaccination rollout will be a little better with the new administration. It's absurdly stupid with the current administration. Right? So let's look at this example in a court decision of Griggs versus Duke Power Company, circa 1971. And some of these cases become kind of seminal. They become what everyone looks at and says, how does this conform to the decision in Griggs? What was the situation? 14 of 95 employees at Duke Power were black. So right off the bat, we can look at what is, the number of African American employees versus non-African Americans. And in this case, what we're saying is basically African American versus white. All black employees were in the labor department. There's 5 departments within this organization, but notice, where are all of the black employees? In the labor department. So that implies there's none in management or any of the other departments. The company required a high school diploma in all departments except labor. And is a high school diploma even necessary for any of the departments? That's a whole other issue. The company extended high school diploma requirement as well as scores on an aptitude to that department as well. The company maintained that any discrimination of this cause was unintentional, but remember, it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not. What matters is the effect of the policy. So the intent versus the effect, it's the effect of the practice rather than the intent that matters. The business necessity, the courts associated business necessity with job relatedness, and that is this new requirement for a high school diploma. Is it actually, can we demonstrate that it's a business necessity? Okay. How does it in fact predict one's success on the job, or does it at all? And the job relatedness, it's not clear whether job relatedness was sufficient to demonstrate business necessity. Right? Deference to the guideline, reinforce the adherence to the guidelines, at least in spirit. Use of tests of job qualifications affirm that the purpose of the law was selection based on qualification, and the high school diploma could not be demonstrated to be a necessary qualification for adequate performance of the tasks within that job. Right? See how this kind of works out? It's like, okay, we have an employment policy. Does it affect certain groups of people differently? And if it does it represent a business necessity? Or is it just some requirement that we pulled out of our ass that is disadvantaging people in certain groups? Remember, if you're a firefighter and they say, hey, you got to be able to carry this 150-pound dummy, and we can't get any women are able to carry a 150-pound, but is it a business necessity? Is it required? I mean, it's been a policy that we've had for a billion years, but that doesn't make the policy valid, right? So it's understanding and how the relationship of what we're testing predicts on the job performance. We always get back to that, right? Let's take another look, another example here, and this is Dothert versus Rawlinson, and this is why employment lawyers are so important, right? The Alabama legislator had a minimum height and weight requirement for prison guards. That is, you got to be at least 5'2", and you got to be 120 pounds. Well, guess what? A woman rejected for guard trainee position for failing to meet these requirements sued the state on the basis of adverse impact. So, Diane Rawlinson is 115 pounds and she's 5'3". She doesn't meet the criteria. She's okay for her height, but not weight. Maybe we say, well, hey honey, why don't you just put on another 5 pounds and then we'll hire you? You guys ever hear anything like that? Don't say that. Oh my God. And so it would be a horrible thing to say. So we do the math, the burden of production on the basis of height and weight criteria. What do we know? 30% of American women would be excluded on the basis of this, right? 1% of American men would be excluded. All right, we got problems then. We've developed a policy, a standard that significantly disadvantages women compared to men. Therefore, based on the statistical evidence, the burden of production has been met. That is, the criteria did adversely affect women as a group. Now, notice, this is the burden of production is, did the plaintiff produce an argument that meets a legitimate standard? And in this case, we see that this policy, right, only disadvantages 1% of the American males, but 30% of the American women. Now, at this point, then, the burden of persuasion. The burden of production is from the plaintiff. The burden of persuasion, then, is the defendant now saying, hey, let me persuade you that this is okay, right? So it shifts to the defendant to demonstrate the job relatedness of the selection criteria. In this particular case, the state was unable to demonstrate that that bar that they set for height and weight had anything to do with the criteria of the ability to be a prison guard. So that's really what it's about. Can we demonstrate that this qualification, this hurdle that we're making people jump, if you will, to become, legitimate applicants or not, or to actually get hired, is it representing some necessary aspect of the job? So the burden of proof for in Title VII claims and discrimination cases, right? And here's a nice little table to kind of flesh it out for you. Production is on the plaintiff, and adverse impact, what's necessary, and disparate treatment, what's necessary, right? And then for the defendant, how do they defend the case? So again, as you're working through the homework, you're going to have a lot of questions. Expect some confusion. I expect you guys to discuss this with each other, to return to the lecture material, either in the PowerPoint slides, or God forbid you have to listen to the lecture again. I don't wish that on anybody, right? But in fact, you'll work through this slowly. And again, I want to reiterate, I want to repeat, don't expect to get it on your first go-through. These are complicated ideas, right? So you're going to have to wrestle with them a little bit. You're going to have to earn your entry into understanding. Understanding does not magically occur because you want it to. It's an effortful process. Okay? So let's move on a little bit. And I promised you this is a long lecture. It is a long-ass lecture. And let's face it, it's not the most exciting lecture in the course. We're going to get more nuts and bolts, and we're going to kind of be briefer in presentation and future efforts. So I hope that makes you feel better if you're not feeling great about this right now. So, defending failure to hire lawsuits. Failure to hire lawsuits can be difficult to defend because of the lack of work history for the plaintiff to rely upon. And also it might be hard to get data on what's occurred, right? Providing all recruits with accurate job description using a standardized, well-documented recruitment and screening process are foundations of an employer's defense. And again, it gets back to documentation. And it gets into a well-thought-out process. You know, if you come to defend your process and you say, well, you know, this is the way it's always been done, or we've seen other organizations and they do it similarly, or we just thought this was a good idea, that ain't going to fly, right? You have to get to the point where you say, well, we've conducted this very stringent job analysis. From that, we derive these person specifications. And to test applicants, we are inspired by the person specifications to create these specific tests for the applicants. And further, we have validated that people who score well on these tests then produce superior job performance. So it really is a 4 to 5 step process. We're in this for the long haul, right? Screening candidate using objective, job relevant criteria, establishing ability to predict job performance, archiving all recruiter and interview notes, so all that has to be kept, right? And interview scores, each applicant can help defend the employer's position and avoid costly court outcomes. It can reduce people's desire to file a lawsuit by trying to generate applicants from diverse groups, proactively and genuinely, and by treating the applicants fairly. And so this is the first step, and this is a proactive part. Look, we understand this, and we've recruited for gender, we've recruited for color. These are things that are built into our process, and we've reviewed our testing processes again and again and again to demonstrate we're not creating disparate treatment, nor adverse impact. And we are focused on assessing bona fide occupational qualifications. If you can begin to beef up your narrative in this regard, you start to look better and you start to proactively avoid lawsuits. Now, we've been talking about hiring. But what about negligent hiring? That is hiring where we hired someone that we shouldn't have hired, right? And this is based on the common law concept that an employer has a general obligation not to hire applicants that they knew or should have known pose a risk of harm to the third parties. One of the most tragic cases that I can think of that's near and dear to Ohio was the shooting of Tamir Rice. When Tamir Rice was shot by the police officer in the park, the officer jumped out of the car, drew his gun, and within 2 seconds had fired at Tamir Rice. Well, we look, and then we, for us in kind of the personnel selection process, step back and say, how did this officer get hired? And what we find is this officer was rejected during their probationary period at the police academy. They were rejected at that point for having an emotional breakdown on the firing line. Now, he was later hired by the Cleveland Police Department. This could, in fact, constitute negligent hiring because you should have known better. You should have been able to detect or know that this person was not qualified to employ a firearm as part of their employment. But these are difficult cases to demonstrate that this person was hired without, let's suppose that Ohio State hires a professor that has a criminal history of sexual abuse, especially abusing the target population, let's say, of young men or young women, right, of college age in a similar context. And this person goes on to molest people, then the people who are molested say, you should have never hired this guy, and Ohio State better demonstrate that they did a records check. If they didn't do a criminal background check, then they may be engaged in negligent hiring, that they should anticipate this and try to prevent from hiring the wrong people. So, in order for a customer-employed third party to win a negligent hiring suit against an employer, the following must be shown. The existence of the employment relationship between the employer, so we have to, take care of that employee-employer, verifying that relationship. The employee's unfitness, right? The employer's actual constructive knowledge of the employee's unfitness. Failure to investigate an employee is a great example. An employee's background can lead to a finding of constructive knowledge. We just never wanted to spend the money on doing background checks. Right? The employer's act or omission causes harm to that third party, and the employer's negligence in hiring the employee is most likely the cause of the plaintiff's injury. Your injuries are the result of this negligent process. So negligent retention is similar to negligent hiring, and this is keeping someone over a period of time who's doing harm to someone and not dismissing them. Right? Now, negligent referral. Definition: misrepresenting or failing to disclose complete, accurate information about a former employee. And this one is tricky, this one is dicey. So what happens if you fired an employee and then you get this call and say, hey, so-and-so listed you as a recommender, what can you tell us about their behavior at your place of employment? And you say, oh, they were fine, they were good. Well, that might not be a satisfactory answer. A former employer can be sued for negligent referral if the employee is involved in some incident at the new workplace that may have been predicted based on their prior behavior. Okay. Now, but the flip side of this is defamation. If I give people information that I shouldn't have given them, or somehow damages this new employee-employer relationship, and especially if it can be demonstrated to be information that is not well supported, then we might run into problems. So to avoid the risk of defamation charge, it may be best to say as little as possible, except those situations where the employee's behavior could endanger. And police departments run into a big problem here because we see continuously police officers dismissed from departments for grievous violations, only to be hired by a different department and continue to commit those similar violations. So, meticulous record keeping then, absolute must. Parent from a legal defense hiring process. The decision is best supported by an ethic of scientifically validated procedures, and that's what we're going to learn to do in this class. And I know this shit seems daunting, but actually, using the tools we're going to learn in this class, it pushes all of these almost to the realm of being non-issues because we'll be so proactive, we'll be so far ahead of these issues that violations aren't really even part of the deal. So what are some of the barriers? General barriers to legally defensible hiring? Well, the just like me bias, and I know it sounds silly, but it really is that straightforward. I like to hire people who are just like me because I'm bitching, so why wouldn't they be bitching? Now, we're going to test for qualifications, right? Stereotypes. Well, I'm not going to hire those people because you know those people and what's going to happen there. And so whatever stereotype. Oh, people from that group are lazy and I need a hard worker. Or people from that group are too loud, right? Think of the categories. Oh, those people, they don't know how to moderate their conversation. They're too loud, right? Ignorance. Some people are just ignorant and they don't even want to learn, right? Prejudice. I'm not going to hire those people because I don't like them. Perceptions of loss by persons threatened by EEOC. And no, I'm not going to do that because, you know, it's going to offend my white employees or whatever. And then hiring managers. And sometimes hiring managers succumb to any of these and interfere with the process, right? Often, think about it, as a human resources professional, your job, depending on how the process is structured, is you might supply, ultimately, we're going to have 100 applicants, and then I'm going to shortlist that 100 applicants to 3 for a single position, and then I'm going to just send those 3 to the hiring manager, and I'm done at that point, right? And the hiring manager then selects the one that they like on the basis of some prejudice or discriminatory attitude. Now, specific barriers to the EEO. Failing to advertise widely in order to attract diverse candidates. So this is something that we have to, again, keep a record of. Okay, so you advertised to this position. Where did you advertise? Right? And we'll talk more about recruitment specifically. Recruitment practices that overlook or fail to seek all qualified applicants. An over-reliance on informal networks for recruitment becomes problematic because then it kind of reinforces the just like me bias or kind of this fraternal organization issue. And a lack of formal systems for recruitment. So recruitment itself is a critical aspect of, do we recruit in a manner that will be perceived as fair to the applicant, fair to the community, and fair to the people who enforce the law, right? Specific barriers, okay. Deficient feedback, performance evaluation, and promotion process of employees. So this is something else we're going to look at the course, is how do we determine promotions to higher level positions? And again, we should have a bona fide application process that includes tests that test for qualifications that have been determined necessary to the higher level position. Let us not succumb to the Peter principle and simply push people upstairs because they've been around the longest. That is these seniority-based practices. Little or no access to informal networks of communication by employees of protected classes. That is an attempt to stymie or stifle their communication. Different standards of performance used for different classes of employees. And many women have argued that I have to work twice as hard to get to the same place that a man would get. And we're all familiar with that argument, right? That often people of color or women are forced into a situation where they have to feel like they're performing like superheroes to ascend beyond someone in the other class that it just turns in an average performance. Lack of equal access to assignments that provide key career experience. So that is, man, look at our favored white guy. This guy's a real hot shot. We're going to give him the hot assignment so he can prove himself. And then we're going to give, you know, someone else in the department all the scut work, which doesn't give them an opportunity to prove themselves. So it diminishes their potential to demonstrate what they're made of and gain positions. HR personnel not included in the recruitment process for higher level jobs, and that's often the case that they're not even part of that process. So, specific barriers, other barriers, okay, in terms of unequal pay, right, might spell unequal opportunity. Counterproductive behavior, harassment in the workplace, employer policies that are not family friendly, and often disadvantage women, first and foremost in that place. Inflexible working hours and working conditions, and hopefully this is getting less so, right? And failing to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with disabilities, and that's largely covered under various aspects of the ADA. And I remember when I was at the paper mill, especially when I got to the second paper mill, the first paper mill I was at was a converting facility. They didn't make paper. We converted paper into usable sizes from giant rolls, right? That's why they call it converting. When I got to the paper mill up at Wallula, Washington, where they actually make the paper in the paper machines, these, you know, the paper machine building for the #1 paper machine that made the white copy paper, etc., this is a building that was 6 stories tall, right? And it's got all levels of basement and tricky stairways and catwalks and all this other nonsense. And often, you know, they would say, oh my God, that damn ADA, we're going to have to make every aspect of the paper mill accessible. And I said, no, we don't. Right? We don't have to have elevators going up outside towers because someone with a disability is not going to be employed in a position where they have to go up there in the first place. So a lot of times there's a lot of hand-wringing about these new regulations as a threat to the business, when in fact they often are not, right? Just simply. Okay. So, other barriers: unfairness of standards used in making layoff decisions, different and benefits given to different types of employees, right? And are people being treated? So think about it. These policies all have to be kind of detailed and records maintained. Inadequate planning for the layoff, and I've worked in a couple positions where layoff pools were common, both at the paper mill and when I worked at the lumber mill, but almost invariably they operated on the basis of we lay people off. The first person to get laid off is the last person hired. So most companies operate in that manner. Lack of communication between employees and employers, sometimes just spelling things out and documenting procedures and decision-making processes can go a long way to avoiding litigation. Failure to provide counseling, job placement assistance, and training to laid off employees, especially layoffs that are permanent. Improper interview questions. Here's another barrier. And we're gonna have an assignment to do just interviews. Let's think about this. How many children do you have? Not an acceptable interview question. What is your native language? And notice I might be probing for your ethnicity at that point in time, and I might also be indicating then that you're not, you know, I don't consider you an effective English speaker. What clubs or social organizations do you belong to? And it has nothing to do with someone's qualifications. Notice, none of these questions actually have anything to do with the qualifications that will be demonstrated on the job. Are you planning any medical procedures? And that again is another no-no question. More on that later, but to give you an idea of what's ahead of us. In summary, if we follow legal and ethical conformance, this provides superior results. And a lot of people can't get around that, but that is demonstrably the way it goes. The law and guidelines exist to protect the applicant and the worker. And these are fellow human beings, so why wouldn't we want to do that, right? Validation is critical to legally defensible hiring, and it's my favorite part of it. And we'll talk more about it as we move into job analysis. And there are often many barriers to overcome. Often we are dealing with very old school people who are very fixed in their ways, or we might be dealing with people who have a high degree of racism, prejudice, sexism, what have you. And these laws are really in part to not allow that to enter into this process, that everyone deserves to be treated equally under the eyes of the law, and let's take that a step further, everyone deserves to be treated equally in the eyes of an employer. So I know it's big. I hope you didn't watch it all in one go, because your brain probably hurts at this point if you attempted that. You can always chunk it. You can always pause it. Anyway, more on the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts. And homework 3 is ahead of you, so start organizing who's going to do what. And check that out. You might, look at the homework and then revisit this. So however your work product works, and let's call it good. Thank you, guys, and I hope you have a good day.